I never thought I'd find myself living in a small farming town again, not after all the years I spent in Washington, D.C., buried in case files and presiding over trials that made national headlines. But life has a way of circling back on you, pulling you toward the roots you once thought you'd severed for good. My father's farm sat just outside of town, nestled among miles of rolling cornfields that stretched out like golden oceans under the late summer sun. It wasn't much compared to the sprawling estate some of my colleagues boasted about, but it carried history, sweat, and the faint smell of diesel fuel mixed with the earthy scent of tilled soil. My old man had built that place with his own 2 hands, and when he passed, it fell to me, the only son left standing, to take care of it. Most people didn't know, and certainly didn't care, that I wasn't just another farmer in the county. They saw the old pickup I drove, the dirt under my boots, and the calluses that had formed on my hands after months of repairing fences, feeding livestock, and tending to the crops. To them, I was just Judge Sam, who had moved back home after retirement. They didn't bother to ask what kind of judge I'd been, nor did I volunteer that I still held my federal appointment. It was easier that way. A man can till his field in peace when no one is scrutinizing every move, expecting him to weigh in on their petty disputes. Of course, not everyone in town shared that mindset. Some people can't leave well enough alone, and some women make it their life's mission to control everything within their line of sight. That's how Karen entered my life. She was the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association, even though this wasn't the kind of place that needed one. The HOA had been established decades ago when a developer tried to turn a patch of farmland into a planned community for upper-middle-class families looking for a taste of country living without the actual hard work of farming. The community only half thrived, leaving behind a bizarre mixture of city slicker McMansions scattered alongside older barns, sheds, and silos. Karen ran that HOA like a tyrant, handing out fines for grass being an inch too long or for mailboxes being non-compliant with the color scheme she personally approved. At first, I ignored her. My land was technically outside the main subdivision, and my farm had been here long before the HOA ever dreamed of existing. But Karen, being Karen, believed her authority reached beyond the thin lines drawn on paper. She didn't like the smell of cows carried on the wind to her manicured backyard. She didn't like the sight of tractors rumbling down the gravel roads. And she especially didn't like my corn barn, which sat like a proud sentinel at the edge of the property line, visible from the backyards of the new development. To me, that barn was history, 100 years old, weathered red paint clinging to its boards, with a roof that had sheltered generations of harvests. To Karen, it was an eyesore and a fire hazard. The irony, of course, is that Karen herself became the fire hazard. She showed up at my door more times than I could count, waving papers and shouting about bylaws that didn't apply to me. She demanded I tear down the barn. She demanded I relocate my farm equipment so it wouldn't clutter the neighborhood aesthetic. I laughed at her the first few times. Then, when she started filing complaints with the county office, I stopped laughing. But I still didn't take action, not yet. My patience had been forged in courtrooms where dangerous men tried to outweat justice, and I wasn't about to let one suburban tyrant get under my skin. That all changed the night the flames rose against the black sky. I had been asleep, the house wrapped in the kind of silence only farmland can offer, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional call of a night bird. At first, I thought the red glow flickering against my bedroom curtains was just the dawn arriving too early. But then I smelled it, the acrid, bitter smoke that doesn't belong in the air unless something is burning. I shot out of bed, yanked on my boots, and raced outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the glow, and then I saw it. My barn, my father's barn, was engulfed in flames, the fire dancing upward, consuming the dry timbers like they were kindling. For a moment, I froze. The barn wasn't just wood and nails. It was the place where my father taught me how to drive a tractor, where I first kissed a girl at 16, where every harvest had been stored with pride. It was legacy, memory, and history all in one. And in minutes, it was becoming nothing but ash. I grabbed the hose, but I knew it was useless before the water even touched the inferno. The flames had spread too far, too fast. Whoever had started that fire had done so deliberately, with accelerant and calculation. The smell told me as much: gasoline, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't an accident. This was arson. Neighbors began to gather at the edge of the property, some clutching robes around their shoulders, others holding cell phones aloft to record the spectacle. I could hear whispers. Some of them probably thought I had done this myself, some bizarre insurance scam or careless mistake. But then, above the crowd, I heard a voice, a shrill, self-satisfied voice that carried through the crackle of burning wood. Finally. That hideous thing is gone. You should thank me. Karen. She stood there, not even bothering to hide the smug grin on her face, her arms crossed like she had just won a battle. For a second, I thought the smoke was playing tricks on my ears, but then she said it again, louder, bolder: "You should thank me. Now the neighborhood looks like it should." I tightened my grip on the useless hose, my knuckles turning white. Thank her. Thank her for destroying my father's barn. Thank her for erasing a century of sweat and blood from my family's land. Rage coursed through me, hotter than the fire itself, but I swallowed it down. I'd learned long ago that anger is a weapon best unsheathed at the right time, in the right place. The fire department arrived too late to save the barn. They doused the remaining flames, but by dawn, all that was left was a smoldering skeleton of charred beams and blackened earth. I stood there, silent, watching the smoke drift into the morning sky. Karen, meanwhile, strutted around as if she'd done the neighborhood a service. Some people muttered in agreement, too afraid of her or too blind to see the crime for what it was. What Karen didn't know, and what none of them knew, was that she hadn't just burned down a barn. She'd ignited a fuse. She thought she had power because she ran an HOA, because she could bully people into painting their fences white or cutting their grass on schedule. But I was no ordinary farmer, no simple retiree. I was a federal judge, and not just any judge. I had sent cartel leaders to prison for life. I had presided over cases involving corrupt politicians, violent gangs, and billion-dollar corporations. I was feared in courtrooms across the country, respected even by those who despised me. And now, Karen had made the mistake of dragging me into a battle she could never hope to win. As the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I made myself a promise. Karen thought she had erased my legacy, but she had only written her own sentence. And I was more than ready to deliver the verdict. The morning after the fire, I walked the perimeter of the barn's ruins, boots crunching over charred wood and twisted metal. The smell of smoke still lingered heavy in the air, mixing with the dew of dawn. Black ash coated my jeans as I crouched down to pick up a half-burned plank, its edges jagged and brittle. My father had hammered this wood into place with his own hands. Now, it was nothing but a relic of hate, arrogance, and petty tyranny. My neighbors kept their distance, pretending to be concerned, but I could see it in their eyes. Half of them pitied me, the other half quietly rejoiced that Karen had finally gotten her way. The sheriff came out that morning, summoned by the firefighters who suspected arson. Sheriff Dale was a good man, one of the few who remembered me from my younger days before I left for the big city. He took off his hat, rubbed his thinning hair, and sighed. "Sam, I don't like what I'm about to tell you. There's nothing we can prove, not yet." He pointed at the blackened ground, the telltale rainbow shimmer of gasoline residue soaking into the soil. "We both know what happened here. But unless someone saw her light it, unless someone comes forward, the DA won't file charges." I looked past him, across the road, to where Karen stood on her porch sipping coffee like she was celebrating a holiday. She waved her mug at me with a smirk, as if daring me to make a move. My jaw clenched. "Don't worry about the DA, Dale," I said, my voice low, measured. "I know how justice works." And I did. Justice wasn't always about immediate retribution. Sometimes it was about patience, about letting a guilty party walk themselves deeper into their own guilt until the evidence crushed them. In my courtroom, I had seen criminals arrogant enough to think they could outmaneuver the system, only to end up in handcuffs when their own pride undid them. Karen had just taken her first step down that same road. I spent the next week in silence, repairing fences and salvaging what little I could from the wreckage. But silence doesn't mean inaction. Behind closed doors, I began my work. My study, lined with law books and old case files, became my war room. I pulled out a fresh legal pad, sharpened my pencils, and began documenting everything: dates of Karen's visits, her threats, witnesses who had heard her declare her hatred of the barn, even her brazen proclamation on the night of the fire. I wrote it all down, methodical, precise, the way I'd done for decades as I prepared rulings that would shape lives and futures. But I wasn't content with just paper. I started walking the neighborhood, not with suspicion but with quiet conversation. A wave here, how are you holding up there? People talk when they feel safe, and I knew how to make them feel safe. Within days, I had gathered whispers. Karen had bragged to some about taking care of the barn problem. She had hinted to others that sometimes you have to do what's necessary for the good of the neighborhood. Each word was another nail in her coffin, though she didn't yet realize it. Still, whispers weren't enough. I needed proof, undeniable proof. That's when I installed the cameras. I had been meaning to set them up for months, to protect against trespassers and thieves, but now the timing was perfect. Every corner of my property gained an electronic eye, infrared and motion sensitive, connected to a private server in my study. Karen had already crossed one line, she would cross another. And when she did, I'd be ready. Days turned into weeks, and Karen grew bolder. She strutted through the neighborhood like a queen on parade, barking orders, handing out fines, and reveling in her perceived victory over me. She even sent me a letter through the HOA, demanding I remove the unsightly remains of the barn or face penalties. I laughed when I read it, the sound echoing through my empty kitchen. She had no idea who she was dealing with. But while Karen played her games, I played mine. I filed quiet motions with the county clerk, probing into the HOA's finances. I knew how to unearth corruption, and it didn't take long before I discovered discrepancies: fees collected but not accounted for, landscaping bills paid to companies that didn't exist, funds misallocated under Karen's watch. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of authority, the kind of crimes that would send ordinary people to prison for years. I documented everything, building a case as carefully as I would against a cartel boss. Then came the night the cameras caught her. It was past midnight when my phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected near the north fence. I pulled up the feed, and there she was, Karen herself, flashlight in hand, prowling along my property line. She stopped near my tractor, looked around, then tried to pry open the fuel tank. My blood ran cold. She wasn't satisfied with burning the barn. Now she wanted to sabotage my equipment, maybe even start another fire. I watched, my hands gripping the desk, as she poured something from a canister onto the dirt. What she didn't know was that the cameras not only recorded video but also captured audio. Her voice came through, sharp and venomous. "Let's see how you farm without your toys, old man." That was it. That was the moment she sealed her fate. I called the sheriff the next morning, showed him the footage, and watched his face darken as the evidence played. "Sam, this changes everything," he muttered. "I can bring her in on this." No DA worth his salt could ignore it. But I raised my hand. "Not yet, Dale. Let her dig deeper. Let her show the world who she really is." He hesitated, then nodded. He knew me well enough to trust my judgment, even if he didn't fully understand it. And so I waited, the footage secured, my files growing thicker by the day. Karen thought she was untouchable, that the HOA shielded her like armor. But armor can crack, and when it does, the fall is swift and merciless. I had seen senators weep on the stand, crime lords beg for leniency, CEOs crumble under cross-examination. Karen would be no different. She just didn't know it yet. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the fields in blood-red light, I stood where the barn once stood, my hands in my pockets. The ground was scarred, but in that scar, I saw something else: resolve. My father had always told me, "Son, justice isn't about revenge. It's about balance. About making sure the scales don't tip too far." Karen had tipped the scales with fire and arrogance. It was my duty to set them right. And this time, the courtroom wouldn't be inside 4 marble walls in D.C. The courtroom would be here, in this town, under the wide open sky, where everyone could see exactly what happens when you challenge justice itself. The weeks that followed carried with them a quiet tension, like the heavy stillness before a summer storm. Every time I drove my pickup down the county road, I could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on me. Some looked away quickly, guilty that they had ever sided with Karen. Others offered a cautious nod, as though silently begging me not to drag them into the conflict. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down on her antics. It was as if destroying my barn had elevated her to some twisted throne, and she relished every second of it. She began patrolling the neighborhood like a sheriff of her own kingdom, clipboard in hand, measuring tape dangling from her wrist. She fined families for leaving trash cans visible, for planting flowers outside the approved color scheme, even for hanging a child's bike against the garage door. People grumbled, but most paid their fines. Fear does that. It convinces ordinary folks to go along, to bend under the weight of tyranny rather than risk standing tall. But fear works both ways. Karen believed she had the power to intimidate, but she didn't know that her every move was being watched, catalogued, prepared for exposure. Each complaint she filed, each dollar she skimmed from the HOA accounts, each neighbor she bullied, it all went into my growing dossier. Then came the community meeting. Karen announced it with great fanfare, sending out glossy flyers with her name stamped at the bottom in bold letters. Mandatory attendance, they read, to discuss neighborhood safety and compliance. In truth, it was nothing more than her stage, a place for her to bask in her self-proclaimed authority. I decided I would attend, not as a neighbor, not even as a victim, but as something far more dangerous. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a gaudy building that looked like it belonged in a golf resort rather than a rural county. The room buzzed with low voices as residents shuffled in, folding chairs scraping against polished wood floors. I arrived in my work clothes, boots still dusty from the fields, and took a seat in the back. Karen stood at the front, wearing a bright red blazer that matched the flush of power in her cheeks. She tapped the microphone, silencing the room. "Good evening, neighbors," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "As you all know, this community has standards. Standards that keep our property values high and our lives orderly. Recently, some individuals, her eyes flicked to me, have resisted those standards. Tonight, we must decide how to handle such matters." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen thrived on that, feeding off the tension like a vulture circling prey. She waved a stack of papers. "I've prepared a proposal to expand our enforcement powers. Increased fines, stricter inspections, and if necessary, the ability to petition for removal of properties that fail to comply." That was my cue. I rose slowly, the scrape of my chair echoing across the room. Karen's smile faltered. "Sam," she said tightly, this is a meeting, isn't it?" I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "And meetings allow for discussion." The crowd turned toward me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their collective desperation. They wanted someone, anyone, to stand up to her. I cleared my throat. "I've lived here longer than this association has existed. My family farm predates every one of your houses. Yet here I am, being told my land, my heritage, is a nuisance. My barn was burned to the ground. Some of you were there. Some of you heard the words shouted while the flames were still rising. A hush fell. Karen's face reddened. "That's enough." I pulled a small remote from my pocket, clicked it, and the projector behind her screen flickered to life. Gasps filled the room as the footage played, Karen in the dead of night, flashlight in hand, pouring liquid near my tractor, her voice sharp and cruel. "Let's see how you farm without your toys, old man." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I let the footage loop once, then switched it off. "This," I said, my voice steady as stone, "is not the act of a leader. This is the act of an arsonist. A criminal. And I have much, much more." I tapped the thick binder I had carried in with me, stuffed with printouts of HOA financial discrepancies, false invoices, and neighbor testimonies. "You've stolen from these people. You've bullied them. You've burned what was not yours to touch. And you stand here asking for more power?" The room erupted, not in applause, not yet, but in angry murmurs, accusations, and questions hurled at Karen. Faces once silent now turned on her, their fear finally cracking under the weight of truth. Karen slammed her hand on the podium. "This is slander. You have no authority here." I stepped forward, my shadow falling over her as I said, low enough for only her to hear, "Karen, I am a sitting federal judge. I have presided over cases that would make your head spin. Do you think for one second that you're untouchable?" Her eyes widened. For the first time, I saw fear, the real kind, the kind that grips the chest and steals the air from your lungs. I straightened, addressing the crowd once more. Justice doesn't come from bullies. It doesn't come from fines, threats, or fire. It comes from truth. And now you've seen the truth with your own eyes. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Neighbors shouted, some demanding her resignation, others insisting the sheriff be called immediately. Karen tried to gather her papers, to bark orders, but the power had shifted. The throne she had built for herself had crumbled in an instant. I left the clubhouse without another word, the night air cool against my skin. Behind me, voices rose in a storm, but I didn't need to hear the outcome. I already knew where this was heading. Karen had burned down my barn. She had tried to destroy my livelihood. She had believed herself a queen. But queens fall, and when they do, they fall hard. And I was going to make sure she didn't just fall, she would never rise again. The days after the meeting felt like the turning of seasons. For months, Karen had strutted through the neighborhood unchecked, her voice the only one anyone dared to hear. But now, silence followed her wherever she went. People who once nodded politely now crossed the street to avoid her. Parents whispered at playgrounds, couples muttered on porches, and the local grocery clerk refused to meet her eyes. Fear had shifted. It no longer bent the backs of my neighbors, it bent hers. Sheriff Dale called me 2 days later. His voice was calm, but I could hear the current of satisfaction beneath it. "Sam, the county prosecutor saw the footage. Between the arson attempt and the financial records you handed over, we've got enough to bring charges. Fraud, embezzlement, criminal mischief, attempted arson, the list is long." He paused. "But I wanted to ask, do you want me to pull the trigger now, or let this ride a little longer?" I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the empty space where my barn had stood. "Let it ride, Dale. A storm like this needs to build until the guilty can't find a single place to hide. When we come down on her, it won't just be an arrest. It'll be a reckoning." And build it did. Word spread fast in small towns. By the end of the week, whispers of Karen's corruption had reached every diner booth, every church pew, every coffee counter. The glossy facade she had polished for years cracked, and through those cracks poured every grievance people had ever held against her. Fines that had never made sense. Projects that drained HOA funds but never materialized. Intimidation that left families afraid to speak out. Now, with the proof in hand, neighbors who once bent under her rule found their voices again. A petition circulated, at first quietly, then loudly, for her immediate removal as HOA president. Within 48 hours, it had more than enough signatures. Someone nailed a copy of it to her front door, the ink running slightly from the morning dew. Karen, of course, didn't go quietly. She stormed into the sheriff's office demanding that illegal surveillance be destroyed. She accused me of falsifying documents, of orchestrating a smear campaign against her. She even tried to call an emergency HOA meeting, but only 3 people showed up, and 2 of them came to laugh in her face. It was during this time that I decided to step out of the shadows. For months, I had let people believe I was just a farmer, just an aging man living out his days on his family's land. But there comes a point when a mask becomes unnecessary, when truth itself becomes the weapon. The local newspaper had called me for comment after the meeting fiasco. I invited the reporter to my study, poured him a cup of black coffee, and let him sit in silence for a moment before I opened the drawer of my desk. From it, I pulled out a leather-bound portfolio filled with my credentials, rulings, and judicial opinions. He leafed through them, his eyes widening with each turn of the page. You're still an active federal judge," he stammered. I nodded slowly. Yes. And I've watched corruption of every shape and size crawl across my courtroom. Karen is no different. She thought she could build an empire on fear, but empires like that always crumble. The only question is how loud the fall will be. The article ran the next morning under the headline, "Feared Federal Judge Calls Out HOA Tyranny." By noon, it had spread beyond the county, into state papers and online blogs that thrived on small-town scandals. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just a neighborhood problem, she was a spectacle, her name dragged into the spotlight of a much larger stage. Her arrogance curdled into desperation. She came to my property one evening, pounding on my door until the hinges rattled. I opened it, arms crossed, and met her wild eyes. "You ruined me," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Do you know what you've done? Everyone hates me. I can't even go to the store without people spitting at my feet." I held her gaze, unflinching. "You ruined yourself, Karen." All I did was hold up the mirror. She trembled, her fists clenched, but for once, she didn't have a retort. She spun on her heel and stormed away, her footsteps crunching down my gravel drive. That night, I wrote the closing pages of my report, binding together the evidence like a judge preparing for the final day of trial. When I was done, I leaned back, staring at the thick folder on my desk. It was finished. The scales of justice were balanced, and the weight pressed squarely on Karen's side. The following week, Sheriff Dale and 2 deputies arrived at her house with a warrant. Half the neighborhood gathered to watch as she was led down her driveway in handcuffs, her once perfect hair disheveled, her blazer wrinkled and damp with sweat. She shouted about conspiracies, about vendettas, about how none of it was fair, but the words rang hollow. The neighbors she had bullied for years stood silently, some with folded arms, others with faint smiles tugging at the corners of their lips. Justice, at long last, had come to their doorsteps. For me, there was no triumph, no gloating. Only a quiet, steady satisfaction. My father's barn was gone, but his lesson remained: justice is not revenge. Justice is balance. And now, balance had been restored. But even as Karen disappeared into the back of the sheriff's cruiser, I knew her story wasn't over. Trials take time. Lawyers twist facts, juries waver, and criminals grasp at every last straw before the hammer falls. I had no intention of letting her slither out from under the weight of truth. If she wanted a courtroom battle, I was more than ready. After all, I had spent my life in that arena, and Karen was stepping into it for the very first time. And in that arena, I had never lost. The courthouse smelled the same no matter where you went in America: polished wood, old paper, and the faint tang of tension. I had spent half my life in places like this, presiding over trials where criminals thought they could charm, bluff, or bully their way past justice. Now, as I sat in the back row of the county courthouse, I found myself on the other side, not as judge, not as prosecutor, not even as witness, but simply as a man watching the slow wheel of justice turn against someone who had thought herself untouchable. Karen shuffled into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, shackles at her wrists and ankles. The defiance that once radiated from her was gone, replaced with a nervous twitch in her jaw and eyes that darted across the room like a cornered animal. She scanned the gallery, searching for allies, but found none. Her kingdom had crumbled. Even those who once clung to her power now sat with folded arms, unwilling to meet her gaze. The prosecutor laid out the charges with calm precision: attempted arson, destruction of property, fraud, embezzlement, abuse of authority. Each word landed like a hammer on an anvil, ringing through the chamber. Evidence flashed across the screen: the footage of her prowling my land, the forged invoices, the testimonies of neighbors she had bullied for years. With every piece, her shoulders slumped lower, the bravado bleeding out of her like air from a punctured tire. Her lawyer tried, I'll give him that. He painted her as a misunderstood woman, overwhelmed by responsibility, unfairly targeted by a powerful man. But the evidence was too strong, too thorough, too undeniable. I had seen weak cases collapse and strong ones win on technicalities, but this was ironclad. Every lie she tried to spin only tightened the noose around her. When the jury filed back in after only 3 hours of deliberation, I already knew the outcome. Guilty, on every single count. The words hit her like blows. She shook her head, muttering, "No, no, this isn't happening," as if sheer denial could erase the truth. The judge, a man I knew well, firm but fair, read the sentence aloud. 10 years in state prison, with no chance of early release for the fraud and embezzlement alone. Add to that restitution payments, community bans, and probationary restrictions. Her empire of fines and bullying had bought her nothing but a decade behind bars. As the deputies led her away, she caught my eye one last time. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw not a tyrant, not a queen, but simply a broken woman who had built her life on fire and control only to watch it turn to ash. There was no satisfaction in that look, only a final confirmation of what I already knew: unchecked arrogance always ends the same way. When it was over, I stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of cut grass and blooming wildflowers. Neighbors approached me hesitantly at first, then with gratitude. Some shook my hand. Others simply said, "Thank you." I nodded, accepting their words but reminding them that this wasn't about me. It was about them reclaiming their community from fear. Back on the farm, I stood once more at the spot where the barn had stood. The ground was green again, fresh shoots pushing through the blackened soil. I had hired a crew to begin rebuilding, not because I needed the barn to farm, but because some legacies deserved to stand tall again. This time, I planned to build it stronger, fireproofed and modernized, a tribute to my father and a message to anyone who thought destruction could erase history. As the frame of the new barn rose against the horizon, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. For months, my life had been consumed by conflict, by fire and fury, by the shadow of one woman's madness. Now, balance had returned. The land was healing, the community was healing, and so was I. But I knew myself too well to believe life would ever be simple. I wasn't just a farmer. I was still a federal judge, still a man bound to uphold justice wherever I found it. My gavel might rest hundreds of miles away in Washington, but my sense of duty would never retire. If another Karen ever rose, in this town or any other, I would be ready. I placed my hand on the first beam of the new barn, the wood smooth and strong beneath my palm. My father's words echoed in my mind: justice is balance. For years, I had spoken those words from the bench. Now, I had lived them on my own land. Karen had burned my barn, but in doing so, she lit a fire she couldn't control. A fire that consumed her empire of fear and left nothing but truth standing in its place. And truth, unlike barns, does not burn.